Hi. ROTO Control is a MIDI controller from Melbourne Instruments, and the thing that makes it unique compared to any other is that it has motorized knobs. That means that as you swap between the pages of whatever it is you're controlling, whether it's a hardware instrument or a computer, the knobs quickly jump to the value of the parameter that's being displayed. The knobs can also give you visual feedback for anything that's being automated. So for example, if I was to automate this knob, then its knob and the knobs of any other parameters I've previously automated will physically move to reflect their parameters' values. The knobs can also provide tactile force feedback when controlling step values. So for example, the chord parameter in nymphs here, you can't feel it when watching this video, but I can actually feel clicks as I step between these parameters. Besides the knobs, you also have buttons and color screens that show you values and names of the parameters they control, something that's fairly rare in other MIDI controllers. The bottom row on the screens shows you what the different buttons do, the top row shows you what the knobs control, and you can customize and rename these using the companion software. When working with a DAW, these knobs will follow values of parameters in your DAW, and there's also a built-in basic motion sequencer when controlling external gear, which can lead to very interesting results when automating synth parameters. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at ROTO Control, how it pairs with hardware instruments and with Ableton Live, and explore the pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Melbourne Instruments sent me ROTO Control. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview. ROTO Control is a MIDI controller, meaning it doesn't make any sounds on its own. Rather, it controls parameters on software or hardware instruments. And it also has a dedicated integration with Ableton Live. In terms of direct hands-on controls, it has 8 motorized encoders and 8 buttons. The knobs are endless encoders powered by brushless drone motors, but they don't make any noise as you automate them or move between devices. While they are endless encoders, they'll limit motion based on the parameter you're controlling. So theoretically, unless you use a lot of force, you can't move beyond this end and this end, unless you're controlling a parameter that lets them turn endlessly, like for example, the tempo here. And I can literally feel clicks as I move this, because that's the way it's programmed, which I won't on other pages. The buttons are all mechanical keys and they're not velocity sensitive, and they can be programmed to cycle between various values. On the left are various general controls. The mode button lets you swap between 3 main modes. MIDI mode for sending generic CCs to control hardware instruments or software instruments on your computer. And then plug-in and mix modes are for DAW controls, where currently the only available integration is with Ableton Live. The left and right buttons will move between, say, multiple tracks in your project or multiple pages of parameters when you control devices. The little tape button controls transport. In plug-in and mix modes, that's transport for your DAW, and in MIDI mode, it's transport for the automation of the parameters that you motion sequence. Function lets you access additional parameters for each of the modes. So for example, clock and sequence length for MIDI mode, or track selection for plugin mode. The learn button is used to learn or map the knobs to the parameters you want to control. I'll show you how to do that in a bit. And then select lets you choose which device you want to control based on the different modes. You can store configurations for up to 64 devices on board in each of the modes, and each device can have multiple pages of parameters, up to 4 pages for MIDI devices and up to 8 pages for Ableton Live plugins. These are currently empty because it's a simple rack. Each page, by the way, controls 16 parameters, so the 8 knobs, but also the 8 buttons if you want to map them. Beside the controller itself, the ROTO Setup app lets you configure additional parameters and name items. For example, all the detent steps for this knob. In terms of build, ROTO Control feels very solid. The enclosure is metal, the keys are firm, and the encoders don't have any wobble except maybe this one. I don't know if it's because it's a prototype, but it's just a bit and it works fine. According to the specs, the screens are color LCDs, but viewing angles are excellent, so they feel like OLED screens. In terms of connectivity, ROTO Control has 2 USB-C ports, one for power and another for both power and MIDI if the device you're connecting it to can give it enough juice, 15 watts. And it comes with a USB-C power supply if the computer or phone you're connecting it to doesn't give it enough power. For example, my M1 MacBook does supply it with enough power, and that's what we've got going on here. But an iPhone 16 Pro, for example, doesn't give it enough juice. Then you've also got 3 5-pin DIN MIDI jacks in, out, and through. As of the current firmware, you can't configure the through jack as a second output to control, say, 2 devices, and you can't pass MIDI through the out jack. So if you want to use a hardware device with both ROTO Control and a MIDI keyboard, you'll either need a MIDI merge device or a keyboard like this one that can send MIDI out and through via its output. So for example, in this setup, to both be able to play nymphs and control it, I've got MIDI out going through keystep and then out into nymphs, so I can both play it and control it. I asked the company about this and they were open to the idea of more routing options in a future firmware update. Okay, let's dive into the details of the 3 modes. I'll start in mix mode, so I'll turn down nymphs and go into mix mode to control Ableton Live. If function isn't on, we'll see all our tracks, and then the buttons on the bottom will arm tracks, and you can arm multiple tracks if you want. If function is on in mix mode, as it is here, you'll control the volume, panning, and sends for the current track. But when it's off, you can use select to choose which parameters you control with the knobs and which you control with the buttons. So for example, now these control track levels. And you can see that they're touch sensitive, so I'm also selecting the tracks as I touch them. But I could say control pans, in which case, as you may have seen, the knobs jump into their correct position. And again, you can't feel this, but as I turn the knob, then there's a slight little detent when I reach the center position. So those are pretty much what the knobs can be configured to, including the sends. And the buttons, as you saw, could be configured to arm or solo or activate or mute tracks. And you can move back and forth between the active tracks, and if you hit both of these, you get control of the sends and the master track. Hit again to go back. As mentioned earlier, tape controls transport, as well as these functions, and automation will be reflected in the knobs as well. So let's say that I wanted to bring this track in gradually. I could go to transport, hit record, and then bring it up. Then if I hit play again, you'll see its value automated. By the way, if I were to move this parameter with my mouse, then you'd see it adjust accordingly here as well. Okay, let's move on and talk about plugin mode within the context of Ableton Live. So here, ROTO Control takes a very unconventional approach, which has its pros and cons. Unlike pretty much any other Ableton Live controller I've seen, ROTO Control does not automap device parameters, at least not in the current firmware. Rather, you need to manually link parameters in live devices to knobs and buttons to make them show up in ROTO Control. So let's say start with a new project and choose the Ableton analog device. As you can see, nothing is mapped by default. And I spoke with Melbourne about this. The thinking behind this was so as not to overwhelm you with all the parameters that a device may have, but rather let you map the parameters that you think are important. If I wanted to map, say, this knob to the filter cutoff, I would need to hit learn, move the filter cutoff knob. And now it controls filter cutoff. Let's say learn resonance as well. So now we've got control of both of those, and you can learn the buttons too. So let's say learn noise, and we now have control of noise as well. Let's try mapping another button to the oscillator shape. So you can see it learned that, and it will now toggle between the different shapes. So again, the pros of this approach is that you control exactly what you want, where you want to control it. The cons is you need to do this for every single Ableton Live device. Once you do, by the way, then this is stored on the device itself. So if I were to take another instance of analog, then you can see I've got immediate control of the parameters that I mapped. And as I move between the tracks, knob positions will move as well. Now these devices have got a lot of parameters, but like I mentioned, you can store up to 8 pages of these parameters. So for example, I could go to page 2, hit learn, and say map panning, and level there. It's pretty fast to map these. And there's immediate two-way communication. If I move the parameter in live, it moves on the device and vice versa. I think it would have been nice though for them to at least pre-populate these devices. And if you like, you can always go ahead and hit learn and clear mappings and change these to whatever you want. A bonus pro for Melbourne's approach here is that if you go into the ROTO Control software, you can further customize these. So for example, if I felt that the filter cutoff was a really important parameter, I could say highlight it, and that's immediately stored and reflected here. Same goes for turning it into a step value parameter like I showed you earlier. That's pretty easy. You can determine up to 16 steps and then name and click between those steps. So those are the basics of mappings. In plugin mode, you can navigate between the tracks, and once you're on a track, you can hold select to choose different devices, or press select to turn devices on or off. So that's how you map Ableton Live devices. As far as third-party plugins go, it depends on whether they have enough parameters that will automatically fit into their device window. So for example, this is Valhalla Shimmer. Once I dragged this onto the track, these immediately showed up once you click on this little arrow. And then to learn these parameters, you just need to go knob by knob, click, tap, click, tap, click, and so on. And if I was to load up a plugin that has too many parameters, then when I click this arrow, nothing would show up initially. You'd need to go into Configure, choose the parameters that you want to control so that they appear underneath in this window here, and then go ahead and learn them one by one. To make sure these mappings show up next time you load this plugin, make sure to right-click here and save as default configuration. Here too, I think it would be nice if there was an Automap once you enabled these. The ROTO Setup app lets you configure these as well. So if you weren't happy with the way the name appears or its color, then it's easy to make those changes. And then another important thing to address is racks. So let's say that I wanted to drag a few effects on this and group these into an instrument rack. So in the current implementation, as you can see, even though I haven't named or mapped these macros, they're already named here, and that's because this is called instrument rack. In the current firmware version, ROTO Control goes by the rack name. So I'd need to rename this rack, say to this. And once it has a unique name, then if I hit learn to refresh this, you'll see it's now cleared up, and then I could map these macros. Let's say do that quickly. Map cutoff here, resonance here, and then learn, tap, tap, learn. So a bit tedious. Obviously, don't forget to save the rack if you want to use this in the future. And again, hopefully they'll add an auto learn or auto map so that once you create a rack, just press a button and everything appears here. So that's more or less how plugin mode works within Live. I did encounter a few bugs and issues which I reported to the company and they said they'd address. I'll add them to the description of this video so you can compare to future firmware release notes to see if those issues have been fixed. And as far as automation goes, just hit record and the knobs will move accordingly. Just a quick Ableton Live tip or trick as far as how automation goes. If you hit play and then touch a knob, then its automation will no longer work. That's just standard Ableton Live stuff. If you hit rearm, then automation will return. So that's pretty much it for Ableton Live. Let's move on and talk about MIDI mode. Go back to nymphs. Here, motorized knobs are less of an advantage as far as parameter control is concerned, because say if I change filter cutoff here, unless this broadcasts MIDI back to ROTO Control, which you can do, this doesn't have a MIDI out specifically, but I could hack it somehow over USB. Regardless, though, the state of things is that if I swap presets, say to this preset, or let's maybe choose a different one. You can see the knobs don't move because synths don't send out MIDI CCs every time they swap presets, unfortunately. But you can gain control of parameters across the synth. And once you do, then they'll be in the right position as you swap, say, between pages. You can store up to 64 setups on the device to control different instruments. So this is the nymphs setup, but I could go into, say, the NTS1 Mark II setup. The knobs will move accordingly as I move back and forth between the setups. Learn would work here as well if this had sent MIDI out. So that's one way to program this. Another would be, as I showed you earlier, the ROTO Control app. And the third way, you can do basic programming on the device itself. So let's say that I wanted to program this knob, just hold learn, press it, and I could choose its MIDI channel, MIDI CC, minimum and maximum values, even its color. You can't name it here, and you can't do any of the cool things that I showed you on the app, but you can get basic controls going here, and then later on, use the app to rename parameters and customize further in ways that you can't on the device itself. You can program CCs or NRPNs, but not 14-bit CCs. Again, at least not currently. You also can't program notes, program changes, sysx, or keystrokes. Those are some things you'll find on other controllers. So this controller is really helpful to unlock parameters that are hidden behind CCs. Nymphs, for example, is a synth that has a lot of hidden CCs. It also has a bunch of shift functions. So what I've done here is expose the shift functions with direct controls. One important thing to remember in MIDI mode is that you need to choose carefully which parameters you map on the first page, because those are the only knobs you'll be able to automate with the built-in motion sequencer. Other interesting things to note is that you can use these buttons to map continuous parameters. So for example, if I turn legato on, even though glide is a continuous parameter, I've set it here to be controlled with 5 steps. If we take a peek in the app, this is how I programmed it behind the scenes. It's a nice way to condense more continuous parameters onto a single page if you don't want to page back and forth a lot. Like I mentioned earlier, chord selection. Even though it's a continuous fader on Nymphs, I went ahead and programmed detents for it. Now, I could have programmed this into the buttons, but then I couldn't automate it, which is a good segue into automation, or motion recording as it's called here. So we access that using this little tape key. Let's erase what I had here previously. So that's the automation for these 8 parameters. Automation is synced to clock, either internal clock or external clock through MIDI, and you can set a sequence length of up to 64 steps. Let's exit out of this. So if I did want to automate this parameter, I would go ahead into here, and the automation will start the minute I hit record. So let's do it. And it will just cycle through the detents. Let's maybe make this sequence longer, go back into transport, hit stop, and maybe play with the filter. So hit record. And I think I may have overdone it with the sequence length. Let's wait for it to loop. Okay. Let's hit stop. Play something. And that's our automation. And it will just loop through that either forward, or let's maybe shorten this to 16 again. And go backwards through it if we want. Or ping pong. Back and forth. Or just go through the sequence randomly. So pretty cool, I think, overall, both for unlocking hidden parameters in synths and for automating them if they don't have a motion recorder like Nymphs doesn't. You can use MIDI mode to control software too. So for example, here, I've gone ahead and mapped to ROTO Control to control Complete Control from Native Instruments. Now, unfortunately, Complete Control doesn't send MIDI back here, but I can, for example, page through plugin parameters. If I had multiple plugins within Complete Control, I could swap through them here. I could move through presets using these and control various synth parameters. Again, we don't see parameter names here. The knobs won't move because that information isn't sent back and forth, but hopefully one day. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for ROTO Control in light of the competition. Now, I'm not going to compare it to controllers without screens that don't show you what each button or knob does. If per knob screens aren't important to you, there are quite a few of those, like Launch Control from Novation or Korg's Nano Control 2, and others that cost way less, and many with bundled keyboards like KeyStep or the Launch Key or MPK series. But if per knob and per button screens are important to you, then competitive options drop down considerably. There's Fader Fox's EC4 with only 4 characters per knob, no motorized knobs of course, but it costs $100 less and is more compact. And then there's Electra One, which lets you see many more parameters at a time, but costs about $200 more than ROTO Control. It doesn't have mappable buttons like this does, and the encoders obviously aren't motorized encoders, but obviously you can see parameter values on its screen. Then if you prefer faders to knobs, there are a few controllers with per fader screens and motorized faders, for example, Fader Port 8 from Personas, but motorized faders of course take up more desktop real estate. So in light of the competition, certainly a pro for ROTO Control are the motorized knobs. However, whereas motorized faders are a significant improvement over regular faders, I think the advantage of motorized knobs is less pronounced compared to regular endless encoders that have a screen next to them that shows their value. Now, of course, having configurable detents is fun, and it's certainly nice to see the encoders move when there's automation, but I can't say that when I'm using, say, Ableton's Push or Machine, I miss the fact that the encoders don't move on their own. The screens do a fine job of showing you what's going on. Then motorized knobs aside, the screens here are excellent quality as opposed to screens on some controllers like the fader ports, which have very limited viewing angles and low contrast. And the buttons here, while not velocity sensitive, do have a satisfying click, say as opposed to pads on some other controllers. The form factor is convenient, as is the spacing between the knobs, and the combination of knobs and buttons works well for controlling different parameter types. And then another pro for ROTO Control is its Ableton Live integration. The colors and parameter values line up really nicely. You heard me complain about a few quirks and bugs in it in this video, but if the company addresses those as they said they would, the live device controls here are very promising. Then finally, on the pros side, the automation of MIDI parameters here is a nice and quick way to upgrade existing synths with motion sequencing. So those are the pros. On the cons side, it's not really ROTO Control's fault, but for its MIDI modes, if the device you're controlling doesn't send you MIDI CCs when it changes presets, which I don't think anyone does, then the utility of the motorized knobs drops significantly. If I swap a preset here, the knobs don't move, they're not going to be in the right place. If, however, in the future, MIDI 2.0 is added to this and to more synths, like Korg synths, for example, something that there's unfortunately no indication that's coming, then the motorized knobs become a serious advantage when controlling external MIDI gear. Then specifically when comparing to Electra One, while ROTO Control has a better Ableton Live integration and physical buttons, which Electra One doesn't have for MIDI and track control, Electra One does have multiple advantages over this, including snapshots, better connectivity, more control options like notes, program changes, relative CCs, 14-bit MIDI, sysex, and built-in scripting based on Lua. Electra One also has the benefit of a user repository of multiple devices, including this one, but many, many others, making it highly likely that the device you want to control already has a preset mapping. However, the ROTO Control software does allow you to import and export presets. Hopefully the company sets up a central hub for sharing templates, which will considerably increase the utility of ROTO Control. On the firmware wishlist side is basically all the cons that I mentioned. So hopefully if this is updated with more MIDI message types, more flexible routing through its ports, and auto mapping for Ableton Live, I think all that will considerably increase the attractiveness of ROTO Control. So that's it for now. There's a full MIDI controller buyer's guide and plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.